The morning sunlight slipped through the lace curtains, painting golden lines across Eleanor's wrinkled hands as she folded the newspaper carefully. The headline about aging with grace made her chuckle softly. Grace, she thought bitterly, was a word invented by young people who didn't understand what it meant to grow old and invisible. Her coffee had gone cold, untouched, as she stared at the family photo on the mantelpiece. Charles, Amelia, and Peter smiling brightly at her 75th birthday party last year. That was before the whispers began. Before they started calling her forgetful. Before they started looking at her like a child who had misplaced her toys. It had started subtly. Amelia would call every evening, her voice sugary sweet, asking if Mom had remembered to take her pills. Peter had begun dropping by unannounced, checking the locks, the bills, even the refrigerator, as if expecting to find evidence of her incompetence. Charles, her eldest, was the most cunning, always calm, always composed, his smile polished like glass. He would bring lawyers' numbers, brochures of retirement villas, and documents she didn't remember signing. At first, she had been flattered by their concern. But now she saw it for what it was, a noose disguised as love. Eleanor had spent her life building everything she owned from nothing. After her husband's death 30 years ago, she had raised her children alone, managing the family business with sharp instinct and sleepless nights. She had bought 3 houses, invested in small companies, and grown their fortune from the dust. She had believed she was securing her children's futures. Never did she imagine that the same children would one day gather around her dinner table like vultures around a dying animal. It happened on a Sunday, the kind of perfect afternoon meant for family. Eleanor had cooked their favorite dishes, roast chicken with rosemary, mashed potatoes, and chocolate pudding for dessert. The smell of home filled the air, wrapping the house in nostalgia. But beneath the warmth, she sensed the chill of calculation. Charles arrived first, dressed in his navy blue suit, carrying a folder under his arm. Amelia followed, her perfume too strong, her smile too wide. Peter brought wine and a nervous laugh. They sat around the table, pretending this was an ordinary family lunch. "Mom," Charles began, his voice soft but deliberate, "we've been talking, and we think it's time you had a little help. You've done so much for us all these years. It's only fair we take care of you now." Eleanor stirred her tea, watching the spoon spin slowly. "Take care of me," she repeated. "Yes," Amelia said quickly. "You deserve rest, Mom. There's a beautiful place just outside the city. They have gardens, nurses, activities. You'll love it." Peter nodded, looking anywhere but at her. "It's really nice, Mom. Like a resort." Eleanor's lips curved into a gentle smile, though her chest tightened like a knot. "And my house. My business." A shadow passed over Charles's face. "We'll handle everything for you. It's too much for you to worry about now. Too much for me." The words tasted like poison. For a long moment, she said nothing. Only the ticking clock filled the silence, each second stretching longer than the last. Finally, she set her cup down and looked at each of them, really looked. Behind their rehearsed concern, she saw it clearly: greed, impatience, and the certainty that she was no longer strong enough to stop them. That night, Eleanor didn't sleep. She sat in her study, surrounded by the ghosts of her past. Photos of her late husband, ledgers filled with years of earnings, and the framed key to the first office she ever bought. She remembered the years she had sacrificed, the friends she had lost, the dreams she had buried to build this life. And now, her children were ready to bury her along with it. But what they didn't know, what they could never imagine, was that Eleanor had never truly trusted anyone completely, not even her own blood. 4 years, she had prepared for this possibility. Hidden beneath the floorboards of her study was a small black safe, one she had installed herself decades ago. Inside were copies of every property deed, every bank statement, and a separate will, one that her children knew nothing about. There was also something else, a list of names, contacts, and one address written in her late husband's handwriting. "If you ever need to start over," he had once told her, "go there." Eleanor pulled out the papers, her hands trembling not with weakness but with purpose. She lit a single candle on her desk, the flame dancing in her eyes like a spark of life returning. They thought she was fading. They thought she was confused, fragile, helpless. But they were wrong. They had mistaken her silence for surrender. As the first light of dawn painted the sky, Eleanor packed a small bag. She placed her passport, jewelry, and a sealed envelope inside. Then she stood before the mirror, looking at the woman reflected there, the same woman who had survived poverty, heartbreak, and betrayal before. The world might call her old, but she was far from finished. This was not the end of her story. It was merely the beginning of her revenge. Eleanor's car rolled quietly down the dark suburban street, the early dawn mist curling around the tires like smoke. She had driven herself, despite Charles insisting weeks ago that it was unsafe for her to be behind the wheel. The irony made her smile. Every mile she put between herself and that house felt like shedding a layer of betrayal. Her destination was a small coastal town 2 hours away, a place her children didn't even know existed. It was where she had once dreamed of retiring with her husband, before life's endless responsibilities chained her elsewhere. Now, that hidden dream was her greatest weapon. The road opened into the horizon, and the first glimpse of the ocean shimmered like silver under the rising sun. When she finally reached the old cottage, its faded blue shutters and ivy-covered porch greeted her like an old friend. The air smelled of salt and freedom. The cottage had stood empty for years, but Eleanor had kept the property taxes paid, the utilities quietly active. She inserted the old brass key and turned it with a satisfying click. The door creaked open, releasing a puff of air scented with wood and thyme. Inside, the cottage was dusty but intact. Furniture stood under white sheets like sleeping ghosts. Eleanor pulled one off and coughed as sunlight poured across the worn floorboards. Still standing, she whispered to herself. She went from room to room, opening windows, letting in the sea breeze. In the small kitchen, she filled the kettle and made tea. It was the first moment of calm she had felt in months. Sitting by the window, watching waves crash against the rocks below, she began to think clearly, sharply, like the woman she once was. By the time the tea cooled, her plan had begun to take form. She would disappear completely, letting her children believe she had gone along with their plan. She would give them enough rope to hang themselves, let them think they had won. Meanwhile, she would set in motion a chain of events they couldn't control. Eleanor opened her handbag and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. Inside were years of handwritten notes, contacts, business transactions, passwords, and the details of every property she owned. She smiled. "Let's see if you can handle all this responsibility, my dears." The first thing she did was make a phone call. The number was one she hadn't dialed in years, Mr. Alden, her old lawyer. Unlike the young, arrogant attorneys her children now used, Alden was a man of loyalty and discretion. His voice on the line was raspy but warm. "Mrs. Blake," he said, using her maiden name. "It's been a long time." "It has," she replied, "and I need your help again, quietly this time." Within the hour, Alden was on a train to meet her. When he arrived that afternoon, he looked older but sharp-eyed as ever. They sat at the small kitchen table, and Eleanor laid out her documents. "They're going to try to declare me mentally incompetent," she said, her tone steady. "I want every legal safeguard ready, and I want my estate transferred into something untouchable." Alden leaned back, studying her. "You always were 2 steps ahead, Eleanor. Do you have evidence?" Eleanor's lips curved. "Plenty." She handed him a small USB drive. "Recordings. Documents they had me sign under pretense. And the proof that they've already started moving money from my accounts." Alden's eyes widened slightly. "You've been recording them?" "For months," she said simply. "They thought I was losing my memory. I was documenting every conversation." He chuckled softly. "Remind me never to underestimate you again." They spent the rest of the day crafting her legal shield, a new will, a trust fund, and letters of authorization. Everything was to be signed, sealed, and stored in multiple locations. Alden suggested a backup abroad, and Eleanor agreed. "And there's one more thing," she said, pulling out an envelope from her handbag. Inside was a handwritten letter addressed to Charles. "This will go to them once everything is in place. Let's see how confident they are when the tables turn." By evening, Alden had left, promising to finalize the paperwork within 48 hours. The house grew quiet again, but it was a peaceful silence now. Eleanor lit a small fire in the old stone fireplace and sat before it, feeling warmth seep into her bones. Outside, the sea crashed endlessly, its rhythm steady and strong. She watched the flames dance, thinking of her husband. "You always said they'd grow greedy," she whispered to the empty room. "You were right." That night, as rain began to fall softly against the windows, Eleanor sat at her desk and opened a fresh page in her notebook. At the top, she wrote in neat cursive, "The Restoration." Beneath it, she outlined her plan step by step. Legal protection first, then exposure. The truth would destroy their credibility before they could destroy her. She would reclaim her name, her dignity, and every asset they had tried to steal. Her second move would be more psychological. She would send them small reminders that she was not gone, not helpless, little breadcrumbs that would unsettle their confidence. A newspaper article clipping about financial fraud left anonymously in Charles's mailbox. A message from a private investigator sent to Amelia's office. She smiled at the thought of their growing paranoia. Let them look over their shoulders. Let them wonder how much she knew. By midnight, she closed the notebook, satisfied. Her plan was simple but lethal. Let their greed consume them while she stood in the shadows, orchestrating their downfall. Tomorrow, she would visit the bank to open new accounts under the trust Alden was preparing. Then she would contact one more person, someone she hadn't spoken to in decades but whose loyalty had never wavered, her old housekeeper Ruth. If Ruth had kept the secrets Eleanor once entrusted her with, everything would soon fall perfectly into place. As the fire dimmed and the waves whispered outside, Eleanor allowed herself a rare, genuine smile. She was 75, yes, but age was not her weakness, it was her camouflage. The world underestimated old women. That was their biggest mistake. Eleanor woke to gulls crying and the scent of rain on the wind, the cottage bright with the thin morning light. Her plan was no longer only in her head, it had teeth and a schedule. She brewed coffee, opened the ledger, and checked off the tasks she had laid out the night before. The first item, contact Ruth, was the most important. Ruth had been more than a housekeeper. She had been Eleanor's confidant for decades, the steady hand who had known where every spare key and secret document was hidden. If Ruth was loyal, the rest would fall into place. Ruth arrived mid-morning with a brown paper bag of sandwiches and eyes that still held the kindness Eleanor remembered. She hugged Eleanor as if no time had passed. Their reunion was quiet. No need for the theatrics children reserved for guilt or apologies. Over tea, Eleanor explained everything, slowly and plainly, as if reciting an old recipe. Ruth listened, hands folded, then reached into her purse and produced a small folder. "I thought you might need these," she said. Inside were pages Ruth had kept safe, old receipts, canceled checks, the faded correspondence between Eleanor and a distant banker about a trust she had once considered. Most importantly, there were notes Ruth had scribbled, dates when Charles lingered too long at the house, times when Amelia had asked odd questions about account names, and a shaky transcript of a conversation Ruth had overheard in the kitchen months ago about reassigning properties. Ruth had kept everything, not because she wanted a fight, but because she had always known Eleanor was 2 steps ahead. Eleanor arranged the documents neatly and felt a thrill she hadn't allowed herself in years. She handed Ruth a small recorder and taught her how to use it properly. "If they come asking," she said, "we'll need more than memories. We'll need proof they can't deny." Ruth nodded, steady and sure. She would go back to town and quietly keep her ears open, pass along any suspicious talk. Eleanor felt the map of the battlefield taking shape. Back in the city, the children moved with the confidence of men and women who assumed success was already theirs. Charles met with the lawyer, Mr. Evans, the one they had hired to smooth the legal edges. He spoke in calm, efficient sentences while Evans nodded, folding and refolding the papers as if they were set in stone. "We'll proceed with the guardianship motion," Evans said. "If Mrs. Whitlock signs anything now, we'll find it difficult to unwind later. Better to make sure everything is locked down." They toasted to efficiency with cheap champagne and congratulated one another on how smoothly the plan was going. They did not know that a small, anonymous parcel had already been left on Evans's desk, a clipping about elder financial abuse with a note. "Practice with care." The courier had been a temp Ruth had once worked with. A brief, careful conversation had convinced her to drop the parcel with a note typed in a font that matched the firm's own letterhead. Evans, a man who never liked risk, kept the clipping in his drawer, but his hand trembled slightly when he reached for it later. Doubt, like a slow leak, was sometimes enough to sink a ship. The second breadcrumb fell into Amelia's life like a silent snowflake. She arrived at her office to find a discreet, professionally printed letter addressed to her personally. It read, simply, "We are looking into discrepancies regarding the Whitlock estate. Please hold any transfers until further notice." The letter was unsigned. No law firm, no agency, but everything about it looked credible. Amelia's palms grew clammy. She thought of late-night calls and hurried wire transfers, of the way she'd whispered numbers into her husband's ear as if passing a secret. Her steady confidence fractured into worry. Peter, who liked to think of himself as the executor of family logistics, found his usual channels clogged. A banker he trusted called to say the branch had flagged a set of unusual withdrawals tied to a new account name. "We need more documentation," the banker said, puzzled. Peter's voice, usually buoyant and blustery, thinned with surprise. He started to imagine auditors and headlines. As the siblings exchanged terse texts, short, clipped, the way conspirators sound when they don't want to be overheard, they began to feel the invisible net closing. Eleanor watched their panic bloom from the safe distance of her coastal cottage. She didn't gloat, she observed. She allowed herself small pleasures. 2 calls to Alden to confirm filings, a midday walk on the beach that soothed the tension in her shoulders. Ruth's early reports came in slow, careful notes. Snippets of conversation, names dropped too loudly, the way Charles had mentioned the safe deposit box during supper. Eleanor logged each phrase in her book as if filing them into a case file. She also began to seed small, public reminders that she was not the frail, forgetful woman they'd portrayed. A letter appeared in the local paper, an op-ed about ageism and financial abuse signed by someone using her maiden name, eloquent enough to read as the work of someone well-educated and still sharp. The piece was unsigned to the public, but the circulation in their small social circle was enough to make tongues twitch. A friend of Amelia's sent a worried message. Did Mom write something? Amelia, unsure, forwarded the note to Charles. They began to talk in a new tone, defensive, small, wondering whether the world knew more than they had assumed. As pressure grew, cracks in their alliance became visible. Charles started leaving his phone face up on the kitchen counter, furious and fidgety. Peter, trying to do damage control, made a reckless call to a broker who advised him against hasty transfers. Amelia, unmoored, called the home one evening to ask if anyone had seen a certain ledger, an excuse to glimpse any change or panic. Each move their children made to secure their prize only handed Eleanor more evidence. Each slip was a thread she could pull. One night, under a sky full of stars, Alden called with good news. The temporary trust documents were in motion. A freeze could be placed if fraudulent activity was suspected. "We won't need to reveal everything yet," he warned. "We'll let them dig their own graves." Eleanor smiled into the line, feeling the cool night air against her cheek. "Let them," she said. "They're very good at burying themselves." And yet she never underestimated the danger. She tightened the circle around her. Additional copies of the new will were stored in 3 separate safes across 2 cities. The USB with recordings was encrypted and duplicated. Ruth had been instructed to keep certain habits, to appear ordinary and not to attract suspicion. Eleanor observed the scaffolding of her revenge with a craftsman's care, every measure considered, every contingency planned. Her children, meanwhile, grew more erratic. Fear which began as a small prick in their confidence spread like a fever. Paranoia breeds mistakes, late-night arguments, misdirected emails, a poorly chosen phrase uttered in anger that was later recorded. They had thought to make her a patient in a tidy room with knitting circles and antiseptic smells. Instead, they had unleashed a force they couldn't understand. H had become their blind spot. They had never imagined an old woman could orchestrate ruin with such methodical calm. As part 3 closed, Eleanor sat by the window and watched the ocean's vast patience. The tide came in and out like the rhythm of the plan, steady, unstoppable. She had moved her pieces into place. The board was tense with imminent collapse. Tomorrow, she thought, there would be a meeting at her house, the one her children believed would sign everything away. She would return, not as a defeated mother, but as the fulcrum that would tip the balance. The night hummed with possibility, and Eleanor, who had been counted out, prepared to call the shots. The morning of the meeting dawned gray, heavy with the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. Eleanor dressed carefully, choosing a deep emerald dress that had once been Charles's favorite on her. She pinned her silver hair in a soft twist and placed a single pearl at her throat, a symbol, perhaps, of quiet defiance. The reflection in the mirror didn't show a frail old woman, but a figure sharpened by purpose. Outside, the sea murmured, its waves rolling against the rocks like a steady drumbeat urging her forward. She arrived at the family house an hour early. The drive was quiet, the road slick with mist, the world smelling faintly of salt and damp earth. The house itself loomed, familiar yet altered by absence, cleaner, colder, stripped of the warmth that had once made it hers. In the hallway, the family portraits had been rearranged. Her late husband's photograph now sat lower on the wall as though demoted. Eleanor smiled at the pettiness of it. She brushed her fingers along the banister and whispered, "We'll put it right again." By noon, her children arrived, punctual and perfumed with self-importance. Charles entered first, carrying a portfolio of papers. Peter followed, tapping on his phone as if he were too busy to be fully present. Amelia came last, her expression taut with a mix of worry and calculation. They greeted her politely, but not warmly. Their words had the hollow ring of rehearsed civility. Charles gestured to the dining table. "Mother, we just need your signature on a few documents. Formalities, really." Eleanor took her seat at the head of the table, her gaze sweeping over them. "Of course," she said, her voice calm. "But before I sign anything, I'd like to understand precisely what I'm signing." She opened her handbag and withdrew her reading glasses, along with a small black notebook. The gesture was simple, but it shifted the air. The children exchanged glances, an unspoken question passing between them. Was she stalling? Did she suspect something? Charles launched into his prepared speech. "It's just a matter of restructuring the estate, simplifying things for the future. With your health concerns." "My health is fine," Eleanor interrupted, her tone crisp. "Please continue." Charles faltered for a moment before pressing on. "We want to ensure your comfort, of course. But legally, it makes sense to transfer certain assets into our names now, so we can manage them responsibly." Eleanor leaned back, folding her hands. "Responsibly," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "That's what your father used to say before every business decision. I imagine he'd be proud of your efficiency." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Then, with deliberate slowness, she reached into her bag again and placed a small voice recorder on the table. The light blinked red. A silence fell, sharp and complete. Peter stopped tapping on his phone. Amelia's breath caught audibly. "Mother," Charles said, forcing a laugh. "What's that for?" "For the record," Eleanor said simply. "You don't mind, do you? Transparency is such a virtue in family matters." They stared at her, and for the first time, she saw fear flicker behind their confidence. She let the moment stretch. Then she took out another object, a folded letter sealed with the insignia of a legal office. She slid it toward them. "This," she said, "is from Alden Price, my attorney. It outlines the revised terms of my estate. You might find it illuminating." Charles hesitated, then opened the letter. His eyes scanned the lines, and color drained from his face. "This can't be right," he muttered. "Oh, it's right," Eleanor said softly. "The assets have been transferred. Yes, but not to you. They are now held in a charitable foundation. My name remains on the board, of course, along with Mr. Price and 2 trustees I trust implicitly." Peter leaned forward, incredulous. "You're giving it all away." Eleanor tilted her head. "Not giving. Investing in decency. Something this family seems to have misplaced." Amelia's composure cracked first. "Mother, you don't understand. We were trying to protect you. The taxes, the upkeep." Eleanor's voice sliced cleanly through the excuse. "You were protecting yourselves. You thought I was a burden wrapped in banknotes." She turned her gaze to Charles. "Do you remember when you asked me to move into assisted living? You said it would give me peace. But peace was the last thing you wanted from me." Charles pushed back his chair, anger flushing his face. "You're being dramatic. You've been manipulated by that lawyer of yours." "Perhaps," Eleanor said, rising slowly. "But at least he listens when I speak. Something you stopped doing long ago." The tension thickened until the air felt electric. Peter stood too, pacing. "This is madness. You can't just rewrite everything." "Oh, but I can," Eleanor replied almost gently. "And I have." She gestured to the folder Charles had brought. "Those documents you prepared? They're invalid. Any attempt to enforce them would constitute fraud, something my lawyer and I have already discussed with the authorities." A murmur of disbelief ran through them. "Authorities?" Amelia whispered. Eleanor nodded. "The Financial Crimes Unit. I believe they're quite interested in certain transactions, ones traced back to accounts under your names. Accounts opened using my credentials." Charles went pale. "You wouldn't." "I already have," she said. "And I've recorded every conversation, every visit, every lie. You made me out to be weak, but you underestimated how dangerous patience can be." For a long moment, the only sound was the slow, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Then Amelia broke down, tears streaking her face. Peter sat heavily, staring at the floor. Charles clenched his fists, but his defiance had thinned to silence. Eleanor took a slow breath. "You see," she said, "I spent years teaching you about integrity, about love, loyalty, and duty, but you mistook my kindness for blindness. You thought age made me irrelevant. It didn't. It made me free of your approval, your control, your schemes." She turned to leave, her movements steady and deliberate. At the doorway, she paused. "You should each take some time to think about who you've become. When you're ready to be honest, you know where to find me. But don't expect my door, or my heart, to open easily again." She stepped outside into the cool air, feeling the mist brush her cheeks. Behind her, the house that had once been her prison now sounded hollow, stripped of its deceit. Ruth's car waited at the end of the drive, engine humming. As Eleanor climbed in, she looked back only once. The windows reflected the gray sky, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw her husband smile in the glass, proud, approving, free. As they drove away, Ruth asked quietly, "Are you all right?" Eleanor nodded, her eyes on the horizon. "Better than I've been in years," she said. "Let them learn what it feels like to be left behind." The road curved toward the cliffs, and the ocean stretched endlessly before her, wild and full of promise. The storm finally broke, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She had weathered worse, and now, at last, the storm belonged to her. Days turned into weeks, and the aftermath of that fateful confrontation rippled quietly through every corner of Eleanor's world. The newspapers never printed names, but whispers found their way into the right drawing rooms and golf clubs. A prominent family under investigation for financial misconduct, one column hinted. Charles stopped showing up to his firm, citing stress leave. Amelia withdrew from her social calendar, retreating into silence. Peter sold his house in the city, his debts mounting faster than excuses could cover them. What had once been their empire of control now stood in ruins, built on greed, dismantled by the mother they had underestimated. Eleanor, meanwhile, returned to her seaside cottage. The air there was cleaner, freer, untouched by deceit. Each morning she brewed her coffee and watched the tide rise like a patient heartbeat. Ruth often joined her, and together they tended a small garden behind the house, rows of lavender and rosemary that filled the air with calm. "You really did it," Ruth would sometimes say, still amazed at the quiet ferocity of her old friend. "You turned their game upside down." Eleanor would smile softly. "No," she would reply. "I simply played by the rules they forgot." Yet, victory did not come without reflection. In the evenings, Eleanor would sit by the window, a blanket draped across her knees, and think of the years lost to loneliness and manipulation. The hurt lingered, like an ache in old bones. She wondered when exactly her children had begun to see her as a ledger instead of a mother. Perhaps it had happened slowly, one ignored phone call at a time, one unspoken slight, until love had calcified into entitlement. She could not change that, but she could reclaim what was hers, her dignity, her peace, her name. One evening, a letter arrived. It was from Amelia. The handwriting trembled, the ink smudged in places where tears might have fallen. "Mother, I don't expect forgiveness. I know we were wrong. I don't even know if we can fix what we broke, but I want to try. Please let me visit." Eleanor held the letter for a long time before setting it down beside her tea. Forgiveness was a luxury she had not decided whether to afford. The wound was still fresh, but beneath it, something gentler stirred, a flicker of recognition that cruelty, too, could be unlearned. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked to the shore and stood barefoot in the sand, letting the cold water wash over her toes. The sea had always been her mirror, unforgiving, beautiful, and endlessly deep. She whispered to it, "Not yet, but maybe someday." The next morning brought another kind of message, an official one. Mr. Alden Price visited with updates on the new foundation, which Eleanor had named the Whitlock Fund for Forgotten Women. It would provide housing, education, and financial assistance to elderly women abandoned or exploited by their families. The idea had grown from the ashes of her own suffering, and as Alden read out the details, Eleanor felt something inside her settle. Her pain had found purpose. "You've built something remarkable," Alden said. "Not revenge. Renewal." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Revenge only destroys. Renewal rebuilds. I've had enough of destruction." That afternoon, Ruth and Eleanor drove into town for the Foundation's first board meeting. They met in a modest office above a bookstore, where the windows smelled faintly of paper and rain. A few younger volunteers greeted her with admiration, unaware that the elegant old woman who chaired the meeting had once been declared unfit to manage her own affairs. She listened to their ideas, housing initiatives, legal aid partnerships, and contributed with the calm authority of someone who had learned the cost of silence. Her voice, once dismissed, now carried weight. By evening, as the meeting ended, Eleanor stood before the window overlooking the small harbor. Boats rocked gently below, their lanterns flickering like stars. She thought of her husband, of the life they had built before greed had poisoned the air. In that quiet moment, she spoke to him as though he were still beside her. "I did what I had to," she murmured. "For them, for me, for all the women who were told to stay quiet." A tear slid down her cheek, not of sorrow but release. News of the foundation began to spread. Articles appeared praising Eleanor Whitlock as a champion for elder justice. Photographs of her smiling, standing beside Ruth and Alden, began to replace the rumors that once haunted her name. Her children, watching from the sidelines, were forced to confront the reality of who their mother truly was, not a frail burden, but a woman reborn in defiance. Charles sent a terse note of apology. Peter left a voicemail one night that began with, "Mom," and ended with a choked silence. Amelia, true to her word, eventually visited the seaside cottage. When Amelia arrived, Eleanor greeted her not with anger, but restraint. They sat on the porch, the ocean whispering between them. For a while, neither spoke. Then Amelia said softly, "I thought we were doing what was best, but it was for us, not you. I see that now." Eleanor studied her daughter's face, the same eyes that had once looked to her for everything, now filled with remorse. "You were blind," Eleanor said gently, "but blindness can heal if you choose to see." They sat together for a long while, the distance between them slowly shrinking, not erased, but bridged by fragile honesty. Before leaving, Amelia pressed a small seashell into her mother's hand. "For you," she said, a reminder that even broken things can sound beautiful if you listen closely. Eleanor held the shell long after Amelia's car disappeared from view, its spiral catching the light like a promise. As autumn deepened, the sea grew wilder, but Eleanor no longer feared the storms. She had learned to find music in their roar. Her garden thrived, her foundation expanded, and peace, real peace, settled over her life like the slow, steady warmth of sunlight after rain. Some nights, she still dreamt of the house she'd left behind, but now the dreams ended differently. In them, she always walked out the front door freely, never looking back. One evening, Ruth found her sitting by the fire, writing in her notebook. "What are you working on?" she asked. Eleanor smiled. "A letter to myself," she said. "For the next time I start to doubt who I am." When Ruth went to bed, Eleanor remained by the fire, her pen scratching softly across the paper. "To the woman I almost forgot," she wrote, "you are stronger than their cruelty, wiser than their greed, and braver than their silence. Remember this, age is not the end, it is the beginning of truth." She closed the notebook and looked toward the darkened window, where the reflection of the firelight shimmered like stars in motion. Outside, the sea answered with its eternal rhythm, a promise renewed with every wave. And there, surrounded by the scent of lavender and salt, Eleanor Whitlock finally exhaled, not in surrender, but in freedom. The past had tried to bury her, but she had learned to bloom through stone.